The bowl was on the floor before her knees had finished bending toward it. A voice behind her told her to eat from it like an animal. The voice did not say her name. The voice did not look at her face. The voice belonged to a young man who had walked into the kitchen carrying a glass of water he had not finished and a plate of food he had not touched. The young man had put the glass of water on the counter and had pushed the plate of food off the counter and had dropped the bowl on the floor and had stepped back and had looked at the woman the way a person looks at a thing he has decided to use for a moment and then throw away. The woman was on her knees. The woman had been on her feet when the young man had walked into the kitchen. The young man had not asked her any questions. The young man had not used words like please. The young man had used words like eat. The young man had used words like animal. The young man had used words like floor. The young man had used the three words together the way a person uses three words when he has decided exactly how to make the woman in front of him be smaller than he was. Her name was Naomi Carter. Naomi had dark skin and her hair pulled into a small knot at the back of her head, and she wore a pair of white sneakers that did not belong in this kitchen. The sneakers had been chosen on purpose. The sneakers were the kind of shoes a woman wears when she is going to do a thing she has decided to do. The woman was 32. The woman was on her knees on the floor of a kitchen the size of a small apartment. The kitchen smelled like coffee grounds and onions, and the faintly sweet, clean smell of a glass of water the young man had not finished. 3 months earlier, the woman had answered an ad in a small paper. The ad had been placed by a family that lived in a house the size of a small museum. The family had 3 children and a wine cellar and a chef, and a driver and a gardener and a personal assistant for the mother and a tutor for the children and a single maid, who did the work the other staff did not do. The maid did the work the family had not asked the chef to do. The maid did the work the family had not asked the gardener to do. The maid did the work the family had not asked the driver to do. The maid did the work the other staff did not want to do. The maid did the work the family did not want to think about. The maid had been the family for 10 years. The family had replaced the maid 7 times in those 10 years. The family had not advertised the position in a way that would attract the same kind of maid the family had replaced 7 times. The family had placed the ad in a small paper that was delivered to a small neighborhood on the south side of the city. The ad had used 3 words. The ad had used the word cleaning. The ad had used the word livin'. The ad had used the word discreet. Naomi had read the ad on a Tuesday morning in a small coffee shop on the south side of the city. Naomi had been reading small papers on small Tuesdays since the year her mother had decided she was going to run for the United States Senate. Naomi had read small papers because her mother had told her to. Her mother had told her to read small papers because small papers were the kind of papers that told stories large papers did not tell. Naomi had been reading small papers for 3 years. Naomi had been reading small papers because Naomi had been working on a paper of her own. Naomi's paper had been a paper about the kind of people who lived in houses the size of small museums. Naomi's paper had been a paper about the kind of people those houses changed when those houses got maids. Naomi's paper had been a paper about the kind of parents those houses produced when those houses had been the houses for a long time. Naomi was finishing her doctorate in sociology at the State University, a few miles north of the South Side. Naomi had been answering small ads as a way to write the paper. Naomi had answered 7 ads the previous year. Naomi had worked in 7 houses the size of small museums. Naomi had been fired from 6 of those houses. Naomi had not been fired from the 7th house because the 7th house had not known Naomi had been there. The 6th of those houses had been the house the young man had walked into. The house was called the Wakefield Estate. The name was written in small letters on a brass plate at the gate. The gate was black iron. The path from the gate to the front door had been laid with small stones the color of cream. The front door was the color of dark wood. The door had been painted twice in the year Naomi had worked there. The house had 7 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms and a wine cellar and a kitchen the size of a small apartment and a dining room that held a table the size of a small boat. The dining room had a chandelier from a country Naomi could not pronounce. The chandelier had been there for 40 years. The chandelier had not been cleaned in tea. 3 of those years, because the chandelier had been the kind of chandelier the family did not want their maid near. The chandelier had been cleaned twice a year by a company the family had hired. Because the company had been the kind of company the family trusted to clean a chandelier the family did not want their maid near. The family had not wanted their maid near the chandelier, because the maid was the kind of person the family had hired to clean the things the family did not want their guests to see the family had not cleaned themselves. The family did not want their maid near the chandelier, because the maid was the kind of person who would have been too visible in a part of the house, the family associated with their own visibility. The young man was named Charles Wakefield. Charles was 19. Charles had been home from college for the summer. Charles had taken the summer off from his junior year at a school in a state Naomi had never visited. Charles had not taken the summer off because Charles was tired. Charles had taken the summer off because Charles had wanted to be home for the summer his father was going to announce his retirement. Charles's father was named William Wakefield. William was 71. William had built the house. William had built the business that had paid for the house. William's business had been the kind of business newspapers reported on in the business section of a newspaper a hand could hold. William's business had been worth more than the kind of number a small paper prints in its reporting on small businesses. William's business had paid for the wine cellar and the chef and the driver and the gardener and the personal assistant and the tutor and the single maid. William's business was the kind of business that used the word billion in its annual statements. William had decided in June of that year to retire from the business. William had decided to retire because William was 71, and 71 was the kind of age a man begins to think about the kind of man he has been. Charles had not thought about the kind of man he had been. Charles had thought about the kind of man he was going to be. Charles had thought about the kind of man he was going to be in a way that came from his father's office, and from his father's desk, and from his father's chair, and from his father's chair that was the color of soft brown. Charles had thought about the kind of man he was going to be the way a person thinks about a thing he has been promised when he has not yet decided whether he wants the thing. Charles had thought about the kind of man he was going to be by the time he walked back into the kitchen that afternoon. Charles had not thought about Naomi. Charles had not thought Naomi was going to be on her knees with a bowl on the floor in front of her. Charles had thought Naomi was going to be doing the work Naomi was paid to do. Naomi was on her knees. Naomi was on her knees because Charles had told her to be on her knees. Naomi had not moved her head to look at the bowl. Naomi had not said a word. Naomi had not asked for the bowl to be put on a table. Naomi had not asked for the bowl to be put on the counter. Naomi had not asked for a fork. Naomi had not asked for a chair. Naomi had not done any of those things because Naomi had been trained by her mother to never give the kind of person who puts a bowl on the floor the satisfaction of seeing her react to a bowl on the floor. Naomi's mother had been a woman named Diane Carter. Diane had been a senator. Diane had been a senator for 9 years. Diane had been a senator for 9 years because Diane had decided the kind of person she wanted to be when she was 11 years old standing in a grocery store in a small town on the south side of the city. Diane had been told by the manager of the grocery store to use a different register because the manager of the grocery store had decided Diane was the kind of person who would take longer to use the register the manager wanted Diane to use. Diane had been 11. Diane had stood in front of the register. Diane had not said a word. Diane had walked out of the grocery store with the loaf of bread her mother had sent her to buy. Diane had walked 3 blocks home. Diane had put the loaf of bread on the kitchen table. Diane had told her mother what the manager had said. Her mother had told her to remember. Diane had remembered. Diane had remembered the way the manager had used her hands to point at the register. Diane had remembered the way the manager had used the word you. Diane had remembered the way the loaf of bread had felt in her hand when she had carried it 3 blocks in the heat. Diane had remembered for 53 years. Diane was 64 now. Diane was still a senator. Diane was running for a 3rd term. Diane had decided in her 2nd term to send Naomi into houses the size of small museums to write the paper Naomi had been writing for the doctorate. Diane had decided because Diane had wanted Naomi to learn the kind of thing senators learn from letters and documents, but not from the small kitchens in the south side of the city. Diane had wanted Naomi to learn the kind of thing senators learn from letters and documents, but not from the small kitchens of houses the size of small museums. Diane had wanted Naomi to learn the kind of thing senators learn from the kind of person a house produces when a house has been the kind of house a family has been for a long time. Naomi had known none of these things when she had answered the ad. Naomi had known that the ad had used the word cleaning. Naomi had known that the ad had used the word live-in. Naomi had known that the ad had used the word discreet. Naomi had known 3 things about the ad because Naomi had been reading 3 things into the ad for the last 3 years. Naomi had known 3 things. The first thing was the kitchen was going to be the size of a small apartment. The second thing was the kitchen was going to be the kind of kitchen in which no one ever said a kind word about the woman who cleaned the kitchen. The third thing was the family was going to be the kind of family that did not know the woman who cleaned the kitchen had a name. Naomi had known all three of those things because Naomi had lived in 6 of those kitchens in the previous year, and Naomi had not yet met the 7th. She was on her knees now. The bowl was on the floor in front of her. The bowl was the color of white. The bowl had held a small amount of pasta in a thin sauce. The pasta was the kind of pasta a chef makes in a kitchen the size of a small apartment. The pasta was the kind of pasta a chef does not finish because the chef has been told the food is for a young man who has decided he is not as hungry as he was when he sat down at the table that afternoon. Charles had walked into the kitchen with the bowl and the glass of water he had not finished. Charles had not carried the glass of water for the woman. Charles had not carried the glass of water because the glass of water had been for Charles. Charles had set the glass of water on the counter. Charles had set the bowl on the counter. Charles had picked up the bowl. Charles had dropped the bowl on the floor. Charles had stepped back and had looked at the woman. Charles had lifted his voice. Charles had asked the woman to pick up the bowl. Charles had used the word floor. Charles had used the word eat. Charles had used the word animal. Charles had used the 3 words together, and the 3 words had done everything the 3 words had been chosen to do. If you have ever been told to do a thing in front of the person who would have understood it most if you had done it the other way, then you know what is happening in this kitchen right now. Naomi was on her knees. Naomi had not picked up the bowl. Naomi had not eaten from the floor. Naomi had not said a word. Naomi had not moved. Naomi had not lowered her head. Naomi had not raised her eyes. Naomi had let the moment stay where the moment had been placed. Naomi had let the moment stay there because the moment was the moment Diane had told her to remember. Naomi had remembered the moment Diane had told her to remember. Naomi had remembered the moment the way a daughter remembers the moment her mother tells her to remember a moment. Now Charles was watching. Charles had not expected the woman to stay on her knees. Charles had not expected the woman to not eat from the floor. Charles had not expected the woman to not say a word. Charles had expected the woman to do one of those things because most of the people Charles had used those words on had done one of those things. Most of the kitchen staff at the Wakefield estate had done one of those things. Most of the kitchen staff had been told to do a thing by Charles and had done the thing Charles had told them to do. Most of the kitchen staff had not had a mother who had been a senator. Most of the kitchen staff had not had a mother who had told them to remember the moment they were told to do a thing they did not want to do. Charles stood in the kitchen and looked at Naomi. Charles lifted the glass of water he had set on the counter. Charles walked to Naomi. Charles held the glass of water out to Naomi the way a person holds a glass of water out to a person he has decided has been thirsty. Charles held the glass of water 6 inches above the bowl on the floor. Charles told Naomi to drink. Charles told Naomi to drink after she had eaten because the eating was supposed to come first. Charles had been told the eating was supposed to come first by his father. Charles's father had been told the eating was supposed to come first by his father. Charles's father's father had been told the eating was supposed to come first by his father. Charles had been told the eating was supposed to come first because the family had been the family for a long time, and the family had decided the kind of thing they eating was supposed to be. The other staff in the kitchen did not watch. The chef did not look at Naomi. The chef was in the back of the kitchen standing at his station and stirring a sauce. The chef had a small white jacket and a small white hat and a pair of small white shoes. The chef had worked at the Wakefield estate for 11 years. The chef had been hired by William Wakefield to cook the kind of food William had wanted his family to eat when William had decided his family should eat a kind of food his business had paid for. The chef had been told by William on the first day of the job that the chef's job was to make the kind of food the Wakefields would have pictures of on the wall in the dining room and pictures of in the pages of the small town paper. The chef had not been told by William to look at Naomi. The chef had not been told by William what to do when Naomi was on the floor. The chef had decided what to do on his own. The chef had decided to stir the sauce. The chef had decided the stirring of the sauce was the kind of thing the chef could do without making a decision about Naomi and the bowl and the floor. The driver was in the kitchen too. The driver had been hired by William 6 years earlier. The driver had been hired because William had wanted to be driven around in a car the size of a small boat and had wanted to be driven by a person of his choosing. The driver had worked for a man in the city before he had worked for William. The driver had left the man in the city because the man had stopped paying him, and the driver had a daughter in middle school who needed shoes. The driver had worked at the Wakefield estate for 6 years. The driver had been told by William on the first day that the driver's job was to drive the kind of cars the Wakefields would have pictures of in the pages of the small town paper. The driver had been told by William on the second day that the driver was not to talk to the maid, because the maid was the kind of person the driver did not need to talk to in order to do the kind of driving the driver had been hired to do. The driver had been told by William on the third day that the driver was not to look at the maid, because the looking was the kind of thing that made the looking a problem for the kind of cars William wanted the driver to drive. The driver had spent 6 years not looking at the maid and not talking to the maid. The driver looked at Naomi now. The driver had stopped stirring the small cup of coffee the driver had been drinking at the counter. The driver had looked at Naomi on her knees because the driver had not yet been told to not look at Naomi when Naomi was on her knees. The driver had not yet been told this because the driver had not been told what William had been telling the driver about the maid for 6 years. The driver had been told the driver was not to talk to the maid. The driver had been told the driver was not to look at the maid. The driver had not been told the driver was not to look at the maid on her knees because the looking was different, and the driver had been looking at different things for 6 years. The driver had not been told that. The driver had been looking at different things because the looking had been the kind of looking the driver had been doing for 6 years, and the driver had decided the looking had been the same kind of looking he had decided it was. The driver had not been told the driver was on his own. The driver had been on his own. The driver looked at Naomi on her knees. The driver lifted his cup of coffee. The driver walked past Naomi. The driver walked out of the kitchen. The driver walked to the small parking lot at the back of the house where the driver kept his car. The driver had a small sedan the color of midnight. The driver had bought the sedan the year his daughter had gone to middle school because the sedan was the kind of car that did not cost a lot of money, and the driver had a daughter in middle school who needed shoes, and the sedan was the kind of car a man drives when his daughter is in middle school. The driver had driven the sedan for 6 years. The driver had not moved his car during the day because the driver had been told by William he was not to move the car during the day because the moving was the kind of moving the looking did not need to do. The driver did not move the sedan. The driver started the sedan. The driver drove the sedan out of the small parking lot. The driver drove the sedan past the gate. The driver drove the sedan to a coffee shop on the south side of the city, where the driver had once worked for a man who had stopped paying him. The driver had a phone. The driver used the phone at the coffee shop. The driver dialed a phone number the driver had been given by his sister last summer. The driver had a sister. The sister worked in the same coffee shop. The sister had answered an ad for a job at a different house on the south side of the city. The sister had got. And the job, the sister had been told by her new employer to call a phone number if the sister had ever noticed a thing she had not been told to notice. The driver did not know the phone number. The driver asked his sister for the phone number. The sister gave him the number. The driver called the number. The driver heard a voice on the other end. The voice belonged to a woman. The woman was not Diane. The woman was someone who had been working for Diane for 3 years. The woman wrote down the name of the house. The woman wrote down the name of the young man. The woman wrote down the time. The woman wrote down the word eat. The woman wrote down the word animal. The woman wrote down the word floor. The woman thanked the driver for calling. The driver thanked the woman for her time. The driver hung up. The driver sat in his sedan. The driver sipped his coffee. The driver thought about his daughter. The driver started the sedan. The driver drove the sedan back to the small parking lot at the back of the house. Naomi was still on her knees when the driver walked back through the kitchen. Naomi had been on her knees for almost 3 minutes. Naomi had not picked up the bowl. Naomi had not eaten from the bowl. Naomi had not said a word. Naomi had not lifted her head. Naomi had not lowered her head. Naomi had not looked at Charles. Naomi had not looked at the chef. Naomi had not looked at the driver. Naomi had looked at the tiles on the floor. Naomi had looked at the grout between the tiles. Naomi had looked at the tiles, and the grout the way a mathematician looks at a proof she has decided to remember. Charles had finished his glass of water. Charles had finished the glass of water because Charles had decided the glass of water was going to be finished by the time the woman was going to pick up the bowl. Charles had decided the woman was going to pick up the bowl because Charles had decided the woman was going to be the kind of person who picked up the bowl when she had been told to pick up the bowl by a person in a kitchen she was working in. Charles had decided the woman was going to be the kind of person because Charles had been wrong about the woman, and Charles had been wrong about the woman the way a person is wrong about a person who has been trained by a woman who was once 11 and had been told to remember a moment the way a daughter remembers a moment her mother tells her to remember. Charles had walked to the doorway. Charles had stood in the doorway. Charles had looked at Naomi on her knees. Charles had looked at the bowl. Charles had looked at the tiles. Charles had decided the woman was not going to pick up the bowl. Charles had decided she was not going to pick up the bowl because she had not picked up the bowl in 3 minutes. Charles had decided she was not going to pick up the bowl because she had not eaten from the bowl. Charles had decided she was not going to pick up the bowl because she had not said a word. Charles had decided the woman was the kind of woman who was not going to do any of those things, and Charles had been right about that, and Charles had decided what to do about that. Charles had walked back to the doorway. Charles had called a name. The name was the name of the kitchen manager. The kitchen manager was a man named Roger. Roger was 41. Roger had worked at the Wakefield estate for 7 years. Roger had been hired by William Wakefield to be the manager of the kitchen. Roger had been told by William on the first day to make sure the kitchen ran the way William wanted the kitchen to run. Roger had been told by William that the kitchen ran the way William wanted the kitchen to run when the kitchen staff was following the rules William had given Roger. Roger had been told by William on the second day that the maid was a part of the kitchen staff, and the rules Roger had been given applied to the maid. Roger had been told by William on the third day that the maid was to follow the rules without being reminded about the rules. Roger had followed the rules for 7 years. Roger had not been asked by William about the maid in 7 years. Roger had not asked William about the maid in 7 years. Roger had been the only person in the kitchen who knew how many minutes a maid could be on her knees before a kettle began to whistle and an alarm began to ring. Roger had known because Roger had been the only person who had ever watched the kettle and the alarm at the same time the kitchen had been on its knees. Roger had walked to the doorway. Roger had stood in the doorway. Roger had looked at Naomi on her knees. Roger had looked at Naomi on her knees because Roger had been asked to look at Naomi on her knees by Charles, and Roger had been told to do what Charles told Roger to do because Charles was the son of the man who paid Roger for the kitchen work. Roger had looked at Naomi. Roger had looked at the bowl. Roger had looked at the tiles. Roger had asked Naomi if she was due. Roger had asked Naomi if she was finished. Roger had asked Naomi whether she had eaten the food. Roger had asked Naomi whether she had drunk the water. Roger had used a small voice. Roger had used the small voice because Roger had been told to use a small voice when he was talking to the maid, because the small voice was the voice the Wakefields had wanted their kitchen staff to use when they were talking to the maid, because the small voice was the voice the Wakefields wanted the kitchen to be when the kitchen staff was talking to the maid. Roger had used the small voice. Roger had used the small voice the way a person uses a small voice when he has been told the small voice is the voice he is supposed to use. Naomi had answered Roger. Naomi had not lifted her head. Naomi had spoken into the tiles. Naomi had said she was fine. Naomi had said the food was fine. Naomi had said the water was fine. Naomi had said all 3 things in a voice so small the 3 things had almost been the same sound. Naomi had then stood up. Naomi had picked up the bowl. Naomi had carried the bowl to the deep sink at the side of the kitchen where dishes were washed by the dishwasher the Wakefields had hired to wash the dishes. Naomi had put the bowl in the sink. Naomi had not said anything else. Naomi had folded the small white towel that was tied to her apron. Naomi had walked out of the kitchen. Naomi had walked to the small room at the back of the house where the maid's room was. The maid's room was the size of a closet. The maid's room was the size of a closet, and the closet had a single bed and a single window and a single small desk and a single small bookcase and a single small stove and a single small sink. Naomi sat on the bed. Naomi opened her small bag. Naomi took out her phone. Naomi dialed a number. Naomi did not dial her mother first. Naomi dialed a number that was not her mother's number. Naomi dialed the number she had been given by the woman she had been working for on her doctorate, the woman who had been advising her on the doctorate, the woman who had been working with her mother for 3 years, the woman who had given Naomi the phone she had been carrying in her bag for 7 months. The phone was answered by a woman. The woman on the phone did not say her name. The woman asked Naomi whether she was safe. Naomi said she was safe. The woman asked Naomi whether she had eaten from the floor. Naomi said she had not eaten from the floor. The woman asked Naomi whether Charles had used a word she wanted to remember. Naomi said Charles had used the word animal. The woman asked Naomi what Naomi had said. Naomi said Naomi had not said anything. The woman asked Naomi whether Roger had said a word Naomi wanted to remember. Naomi said Roger had asked whether she was done in a small voice. The woman asked Naomi whether Naomi was sure Naomi wanted to keep her notebook. Naomi said Naomi wanted to keep her notebook. The woman asked Naomi whether Naomi was sure Naomi wanted to keep the phone. Naomi said Naomi wanted to keep the phone. The woman thanked Naomi for calling. The woman told Naomi she was going to send a person to the Wakefield estate tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and the person was going to ring the bell at the gate, and the person was going to ring the bell once, and the person was going to wait. Naomi thanked the woman for her time. Naomi hung up the phone. Naomi put the phone back in the small bag. Naomi sat on the bed. Naomi did not open the bookcase. Naomi did not read the small books she had been reading for the doctorate. Naomi did not read the small books because the small books would have to wait, and the small books had been waiting for a long time. Naomi sat on the bed for almost 10 minutes. Then Naomi stood up. Naomi walked out of the maid's room. Naomi walked to the back of the kitchen. Naomi picked up a mop from the small closet behind the kitchen. Naomi walked to the tiles she had been kneeling on. Naomi mopped the tiles. Naomi mopped the tiles, and she did not say a word. And the mopping was the mopping of a woman who had decided the tiles had been dirtied by something that had to be cleaned. And the cleaning was the cleaning deserved. Charles had walked back into the kitchen before Naomi had finished mopping. Charles had been carrying a small book the color of blue. Charles had put the book on the counter. Charles had been about to ask Naomi a question about the book. Charles had looked at Naomi mopping the tiles. Charles had been about to ask Naomi a question. Charles had decided to ask Naomi the question on a different day because Naomi had been mopping on the afternoon of the day. Charles had decided the question had to be asked the way Charles had decided the question had to be asked. Charles had decided to ask Naomi on a Tuesday afternoon. Charles had decided Tuesday was going to be the day Charles asked Naomi the question. Charles had decided Tuesday because Tuesday was the day the kitchen had been cleaning the kind of things the kitchen had been cleaning on Tuesdays. Charles had walked out of the kitchen with the book. Charles had walked into the library at the back of the house. What the woman on the phone did next filled the next 24 hours with the kind of work nobody sees. The woman called Diane. The woman told Diane that Naomi had called. The woman told Diane Naomi had not eaten from the floor. The woman told Diane Charles had used the word animal. The woman told Diane Roger had used a small voice. The woman told Diane Naomi had mopped the tiles. The woman told Diane Naomi had not said a word. Diane had listened to the woman for almost 40 seconds. Diane had not said anything for almost 20 seconds after the woman had finished. Then Diane had said the word tomorrow. Diane had said the word at 3. Diane had said the word once. Diane had thanked the woman. Diane had hung up the phone. Diane did not call William. Diane did not call Charles. Diane did not call a lawyer. Diane did not call the small paper. Diane called a woman named Patricia. Patricia had been the driver who had taken Naomi to the airport the day Naomi had gone to the airport to take a small plane to a small town in the south side of the state 2 years before to interview a woman who had been the kind of woman who had been doing the kind of job Naomi had been doing in the kind of houses Naomi had been working in. Patricia had been the driver the year Patricia had been working in a kitchen the size of a small apartment. Patricia had been the driver the year Patricia had decided she was going to be the kind of driver who drove senators to the kind of places senators had to go. Patricia picked up the phone on the second ring. Patricia asked Diane what she needed. Diane told Patricia she needed a car the next morning at 7. Patricia said she would have a car the next morning at 7. Patricia asked Diane whether the car should be a black sedan or a black town car. Diane said the car should be a black town car because the town car was the kind of car senators drove when senators wanted to be driven to a house, in a way senators wanted to be driven to a house. Patricia said the town car would be ready at 7. Patricia asked Diane where she wanted to be driven. Diane said the Wakefield estate. The next morning at 7, Diane was at the gate of the Wakefield estate in a black town car the color of midnight. The driver held the door open for Diane. Diane stepped out of the town car. Diane wore a blue blazer she had worn to 3 hearings and 2 funerals and a wedding. The blazer had been worn by Diane for almost a year. The blazer had been chosen on purpose. The blazer was the kind of blazer Diane wanted to wear to the Wakefield estate because Diane wanted to wear a blazer that was the right kind of blazer for the kind of work Diane was going to do at the Wakefield estate. Diane walked to the gate. Diane pressed the small button on the brass plate. Diane waited. The gate opened. A man who worked at the gate was named Henry. Henry had been the gate man for 9 years. Henry had been hired by William Wakefield because William had wanted a man at the gate who would be the kind of man the Wakefields wanted at the gate. Henry opened the gate because Henry had been told to open the gate for the kind of people who wanted to come in, and Henry had decided Diane was the kind of person who wanted to come in. Henry had been wrong about Diane the way Henry is wrong about a senator driving to the gate of a house in a town car, because Henry had been wrong about a lot of things. Diane walked up the path of small stones. Diane walked to the front door. Diane pressed the small button the size of a thumb. Diane waited. A woman named Pamela opened the front door. Pamela was the personal assistant to William Wakefield. Pamela had worked for William for 12 years. Pamela had been hired by William because William had wanted someone to manage his calendar and answer his phone and open his front door for people who had been invited into his house. Pamela had not known Diane was the kind of person who had been invited into the house. Pamela had looked at Diane. Pamela had looked at the blazer. Pamela had looked at the feet. Pamela had decided Diane was the kind of person who was invited into the house. Pamela was wrong about that.